Russia, the world's second most powerful military, versus Ukraine, ranked at the number 22 spot. It's a military of 850,000 versus Ukraine's 200,000, a force overmatch that should spell easy victory for Russia. So, why is the Russian invasion of Ukraine going so poorly? First, what does Russia even want in Ukraine to begin with? It's important to understand that this is not Russia's war, it's Vladimir Putin's war. For Putin, restoring the old Soviet bloc has been a dream since he saw the Soviet Union crumble around him in the late 80s and early 90s. It's not just a matter of pride, though. Putin sees relation with the West as a zero-sum game. In other words, there can only be one winner, and in his mind, it must be him and Russia. Initially, Putin drew closer to the West as Russia signed cooperation agreements with NATO. For a while, it looked like the old hostilities between NATO and Russia were over, and a new future together was possible. However, as he was cozying up to the West, he was busy undermining it by using his intelligence services to influence Western democracies, as we saw during the 2016 U.S. presidential election, where U.S. security services confirmed that Russia was attempting to influence American voters. Ukraine's wish to join NATO, though, would place yet another NATO country on his doorstep, something that amounts to a strategic disaster for Russia. Having been the victim of many invasions throughout history, Russia's worked hard to create a buffer between itself and the West for decades after World War II. Today, most of that work has been undone, and Russia's potential adversaries now sit on its northwestern flank. In case of war, if Ukraine joined the alliance, it would allow NATO access straight into the soft underbelly of Russia. Ukraine joining NATO is simply unacceptable to Putin, and in his mind, it's vital for Russia's national security that Ukraine be friendly to Russia, or at least unfriendly to the West. Ukraine's growing desire for NATO membership thus represented a significant threat to Putin's goals of keeping NATO away, and its perceived weakness gave him a chance to put the former Soviet republic back into Russia's sphere of influence. He just needed to topple the national government and install a new one friendly to his interests. The seeds of today's invasion began with protests launched in 2013 after the Ukraine national government rejected the signing of the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was meant to establish a pathway to EU membership in favor of closer ties with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. Many in Ukraine saw this as Moscow influencing Ukrainian policy and a revolution swept across the nation. However, not all of Ukraine wanted closer ties to the West, leading to the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. In response for a call for help from the Ukrainian president shortly after he was removed from power, Russia annexed Crimea and sent aid to separatists fighting Ukrainian national forces. Rather than deter the new Ukrainian government from joining NATO and the EU, though, this only created a sense of urgency for Ukraine. Joining the EU and NATO was seen as a matter of national security, and given Russia's invasion, the fear was well grounded. After rebuffing his threats if they should draw closer to the West, Putin saw an invasion as his only option. So what's gone wrong with the Russian invasion? Any good military operation starts with clearly defined goals, and here's where Putin's invasion met with its first strategic disaster. In multiple speeches, Putin made it clear that this was a special military operation tasked with denazifying Ukraine and ending a genocide of Russian-speaking people. This is not just blatantly false, as the thought of a Jew whose family died in the Holocaust leading a Nazi government is ridiculous in the extreme, but also not valid strategic goals. Generals need clear objectives so they can make plans to achieve them. By all accounts, Russia's invasion lacked set objectives. While removing Volodymyr the Iron Joker Zelensky from power was always a goal for Russia's armed forces, how exactly to do that and when was not clearly delineated. Should Zelensky be simply toppled, his government neutralized and rendered ineffective via exile, or should Zelensky and any supporters be arrested or killed? While it's still difficult to get an accurate picture of what has been going on behind the scenes in the Kremlin, we know that the Russian army seemed unclear of these two questions. At the start of the invasion, forces from Belarus began a march toward Kiev, while a full assault in the east aimed to push Ukraine's defenders back. Yet significant air power was not given to these forces advancing on Kiev, slowing the advance down to a crawl. Meanwhile, Russian forces elsewhere seemed set on a strategy of conquering Ukraine piece by piece by defeating enemy forces in place and securing territory as they advance. This was not a war with the goal of removing Ukraine's government, but rather a war of conquest. The lack of clear, well-defined objectives led to the Russian military getting bogged down early and quickly, as it seemed to fight anywhere it discovered Ukrainian troops, as opposed to quickly moving to secure strategic objectives. This type of war heavily favors the defender, as it leaves them in complete control of when and where battles take place. However, it cost Russia something even more important: time. The longer that Zelensky remained safely out of Russian hands, the longer he had to influence the world, something he did with stunning effectiveness. Each day that passed, Zelensky was able to rally more and more supporters from across the international community, leading to the fastest and most severe sanctions imposed on a nation in modern history. Zelensky's defiance of Putin also emboldened NATO and other countries to provide direct military aid to Ukraine, even leading to such unbelievable moves as the EU supplying the Ukrainian Air Force with fighter jets. Before the invasion, the US and its partners believed that shipping of such significant war material would only serve to provoke Russia into greater aggression and was unthinkable. However, as Zelensky managed to turn global opinion against Putin and the Russian military mired itself in pointless fighting, opinion amongst the US and partners quickly changed. Eventually, Putin realized his grave error, and at last clear instructions seemed to be given to his commanders: neutralize Zelensky and seize major cities at all costs. Suddenly, Russian forces changed tactics, and they were no longer bogging themselves down fighting Ukrainian defenders where they encountered them. Now they were bypassing entire Ukrainian positions to rush to secure major cities. Even more importantly, the push for Kiev began in earnest, with hundreds of vehicles and thousands of troops in reserve poured straight into the fight for Kiev in a bid to overwhelm the city's defenders. As of the writing of this script, the massive Russian advance on Kiev seems to be halted due to supply problems, though. Not relying on conventional forces, though, there's evidence that Putin has dispatched special forces kill squads to eliminate Zelensky, and Kiev has been locked down as the hunt for infiltrators continues. Russian electronic warfare assets sniff through signals coming in and out of the Ukrainian capital, with the goal of pinpointing Zelensky's exact location for an airstrike. Zelensky is finally a wanted man, but killing him now will not undo Putin's major strategic blunder. Russian troops called Zelensky a clown before the invasion, but now his own troops call him the Iron Joker. And the Iron Joker has already defeated Putin on the world stage by rallying it against him. Killing Zelensky now will only turn him into a martyr and a rallying point for Ukraine's defenders. Had Russia acted swiftly to take Kiev and neutralize Zelensky, something its conventional forces should have been capable of within days of the invasion, Putin may not have suffered as badly on the global stage as he had. The longer this invasion drags on, the worse it gets for Putin's Russia, as the world turns its back on every facet of Russian business and culture. As new intelligence has revealed, though, Putin didn't just fail at setting strategic goals for his military, he actually didn't even let most of his military leadership know about the invasion beforehand. While they were certainly aware of the buildup of troops along the border with Ukraine, even his most senior generals were blindsided by the order to invade. Putin had kept his plan to invade Ukraine so close to his chest that only a small group of individuals very close to him ever knew. Without foreknowledge of the coming invasion, Russia's generals had no way of drawing up battle plans and being prepared to prosecute Putin's orders. Instead, they were forced to improvise on the run, a recipe for disaster. The fact that most of the invasion troops were pulled from across the entire Russian nation also meant that once hostilities began, there was no time to coordinate and integrate chains of command. We've seen plenty of evidence that Russian military has been infighting amongst itself, and even engaging in full-blown arguments over radio. With no overarching strategy or chain of command, Putin's army is disorganized and ineffective. Putin's second invasion disaster was a stunning intelligence failure that ranks amongst the worst in world history. Putin told his troops they'd be greeted as liberators by Ukraine's large number of Russian speakers. In fact, his entire battle plan relied on his troops being seen as the liberating country, not the invading one. Thus, Russia's invasion force was by design smaller than required. Even with all of his reserves committed, Putin's forces in Ukraine are simply not enough to pacify a country that does not want Russians on their soil. As Russian troops poured into Ukraine, they weren't met with flowers as promised, they were met with javelins and Molotov cocktails. Even in the most pro-Russian parts of Ukraine's east, the people have continued to rise up against what they see as occupiers and invaders. This has not just severely slowed the advance, but bogged Russian troops down in pacification operations. Troop-to-task analysis, or the analysis of how many troops are required to achieve a certain task, is notoriously unreliable. But even by the most optimistic of estimates, Putin's invasion force was not up for the task of pacifying a nation that did not welcome them as liberators. American analysts estimate that a successful counterinsurgency requires at minimum a 20 to 1,000 ratio of troops, 20 troops for every 1,000 civilians. This is merely an estimate, but even by this number, the Russians would need 340,000 troops to successfully neutralize a Ukraine insurgency. Russia, though, has poured 150,000 troops in its attempt to seize Ukraine, roughly a third of the total Russian ground combatants. While it will almost certainly prove to be sufficient for neutralizing Ukraine's military and installing a puppet regime, it's completely insufficient for actually controlling the country. Without immediately pouring more troops into the conflict, All Russia has succeeded in doing is ensuring that Ukraine becomes its own version of America's and the Soviet Union's Afghanistan, only much deadlier for its interest in troops both. There are signs that Russia's looking to fix this mistake, and by the time you see this video, those plans might have been put into effect. As of the writing of this script, rumors amongst the global intelligence community is that Russia is planning on instituting a draft to draw up the necessary troop numbers to neutralize Ukraine. Whether this is true or not, what is true is that as Russia's forces currently stand, achieving any sort of strategic success in Ukraine is currently impossible. Russia's next biggest pre-invasion failure was a logistical one. Before the invasion actually took place, Putin famously said that he was drawing down some of his forces to de-escalate tensions. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Maybe there wouldn't be an invasion after all. But just days later, Putin ordered his forces into action. Was he simply trying to lower Ukraine's and the world's guard? Not quite. According to Western intelligence, Putin's claim of drawing down forces was actually so his forces could do something that should have warned him the Russian military wasn't ready for invasion. As Putin moved his timetable for invasion along, an estimated up to 20% of his combat vehicles were in disrepair. The claim of drawing down forces was instead a ruse to allow his military to tow broken-down vehicles away from staging areas for repairs. This has been substantiated by media who have visited both the Russian-Ukraine and Belarus-Ukraine border since the invasion and discovered dozens of broken-down vehicles left behind in the process of being towed or repaired. With the Russian military suffering from sanctions for years and a stagnant economy back home, it's no surprise that so much Russian firepower was inoperable. But the sheer scale of broken-down equipment on the eve of full combat is shocking compared to a modern military such as the United States, which the Russian military theoretically is supposed to fight and win against. But this isn't where Russia's logistics problems end. As the invasion unfolded, Russian troops made slow but steady progress into Ukraine, and then suddenly stopped altogether for a few days. To the world's surprise, entire units had simply run out of fuel, ammunition, or food, and vehicles were abandoned by the dozens across Ukraine. How could this happen? As has been famously noted before, the Russian military has always had a problem with logistics. Compared to the United States, Russian units operated with up to 75% fewer logistics personnel, perhaps reflecting Cold War-era mentality that units were not believed to be survivable in a nuclear battlefield and would thus be destroyed or rendered combat ineffective long before significant resupply was necessary. It may also be simply due to poor military planning and a completely unrealistic expectation that heavy fighting would be sporadic and rare. Whatever the reason, Russian units began to run into supply problems by the third day of the invasion, further setting back their ability to make quick strategic gains necessary to circumvent mounting international outrage. Even worse, they left them at the mercy of Ukrainian air attack and lightning raids, with hundreds of Russian vehicles destroyed. Bottlenecks caused by stuck vehicles also gave the Ukrainian armed forces an opportunity to launch devastating raids and resupply themselves by pillaging the remains. But even as supply problems began to sort themselves out, a lack of Russian logistics led to massive traffic jams and further delay of critical objectives, such as the taking of Kiev. The famous column of vehicles attacking Kiev stretched for up to 60 kilometers at one point, snarled up in the world's largest traffic jam. Meanwhile, Kiev's defenders used the time to equip civilians and build defenses. Logistics might not be as glamorous as infantry, artillery, or tanks, but without good logistics, a modern army can't win. Force structure, though, was yet another of Russia's biggest mistakes. Details on the composition of the Russian military units are hard to discern, given that such things are valuable military secrets. It's been widely reported, however, that a large number of Russian soldiers invading Ukraine are conscripts, and we know that approximately 200,000 of Russia's nearly 1 million strong military are conscripts. Conscription in Russia is a mandatory 12-month service period for males aged 18 to 27. While Russia has made great strides in creating a professional all-volunteer fighting force, such as the US, it still relies heavily on conscripts, and even 1/4 of its elite Spetsnaz units are made of conscripts. But the problem with conscripts, as Ukraine has highlighted, are numerous. First, conscripts are short service terms, meant that they'll lack the skills and training of a professional soldier with multiple years under his or her belt. Pitting Russia's conscript force against Ukraine's mostly professional force is a bad idea with predictable results. Secondly, though, conscripts have notoriously low morale and will to fight, as opposed to a professional soldier who has chosen to take up arms. This has never been clearer than in the way Russia's army has faced massive insubordination, surrender, and outright sabotage of their own equipment to avoid fighting. While the Russian army remains intact, many units of soldiers have surrendered themselves, even to unarmed civilians, in order to avoid fighting. And U.S. intelligence reports that Russian soldiers have taken to punching holes in their own gas tanks to avoid having to move to the front. Intercepted radio communications have shown Russian